Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack a truly fascinating era of history, the Crucible of colonization. We're zeroing in on the historical buildup right up to 1754. You know, we often look back at the American Revolution as this, well, inevitable event, right? Like it was just destiny waiting to happen. But to actually understand how the explosion went off in 1776, we have to look at the pressure cooker that was quietly building in the decades before it. And that brings up a really crucial question, one that kind of challenges a major misconception we all have. We tend to picture the 13 mainland colonies as this unified, tight-knit family, just tapping their feet, waiting for the perfect moment to rebel against their parent. But the reality? No way. By 1750, they were incredibly isolated settlements, literally just separate communities that accidentally happened to share the eastern seaboard of North America. So, how exactly do disconnected, highly isolated groups of people suddenly forge a shared identity and launch a completely unified revolution? Well, here's our roadmap for today. 1. Uniting 13 disconnected colonies. 2. Mercantilism and imperial trade. 3. The power of salutary neglect. 4. The First Great Awakening. And 5. The Crucible of American identity. We're going to uncover how 3 key ingredients, economics, politics, and religion, combined to create an absolute perfect storm for revolution. Section 1. Uniting 13 disconnected colonies. So, if these colonies weren't naturally connected to each other, what actually bound them together? Well, the answer is this overarching British imperial system. They were embedded in this giant framework of commercial logic, administrative habits, and religious culture that ultimately connected them, not just to each other, but to an entire Atlantic world stretching from West Africa all the way to the Caribbean. Now, to understand the British mindset back then, we really have to look at the core economic assumption of the day, which was mercantilism. Mercantilist thinkers believed that wealth was finite. It was a strict zero-sum game. Think of it like a single pie. If England gained a piece of that pie, it meant France or Spain had to lose one. In this framework, colonies really only had one singular purpose, and that was to enrich the mother country. They existed to supply raw materials that England couldn't produce, buy up English manufactured goods, and of course, generate customs revenue for the British Treasury. Section 2. Mercantilism and imperial trade. So this was essentially the economic rulebook that Britain tried to impose on a massive transatlantic scale. Parliament created this rulebook through what we know as the Navigation Acts. Starting in 1651, these statutes strictly regulated colonial trade, and the rules were actually pretty straightforward. Certain enumerated goods, we're talking highly valuable stuff like tobacco, sugar, rice, and indigo, could only be sold directly to England. Plus, all trade had to be carried on English or colonial ships. And if any European goods were heading to the colonies, they had to go through English middlemen first. Now, this setup generated enormous wealth for English merchants, absolutely, but it imposed some very real, very heavy costs on colonial planters and merchants who were legally barred from just going out and finding better prices on the open European market. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive gap between the rules on paper and the reality out on the ocean. The classic triangular trade moved manufactured goods from England to West Africa, enslaved captives to the Americas, and then commodities back to England. But the reality? Yeah, it was a whole lot messier. New England merchants were actively subverting this system. They ran their own sneaky, totally rule-breaking route, smuggling rum to West Africa, enslaved people to the Caribbean, and molasses right back to New England. They deliberately cut out those English middlemen, which of course technically violated British laws like the Molasses Act of 1733. Section 3. The power of salutary neglect. This brings us to a really fascinating twist in the story, our second pillar. And there's a deep irony here, because it turns out that bureaucratic inaction is exactly what taught the colonies how to govern themselves. You see, on paper, the Navigation Acts demanded strict customs and total control from London. But in reality, for most of the 17th and early 18th centuries, enforcement was a total joke. Customs officials were vastly understaffed or just blatantly corrupt. Plus, London was completely distracted by various European wars. So, under Prime Minister Robert Walpole, this sort of evolved into an informal policy of salutary neglect. The British government basically just turned a blind eye, allowing the colonies a ton of latitude in their commercial and political affairs, mainly just to avoid costly confrontations. But the long-term effect of this neglect was profound. I mean, decades of this blind eye served as an unintended training ground for an entire colonial political class. Local assemblies, like the Virginia House of Burgesses or the Massachusetts General Court, quietly started accumulating real, tangible legislative authority. And because no one in London was bothering to stop them, they just started controlling their own governor's salaries and passing their own local tax laws. Before long, they actually started to view themselves as the local equivalents of parliament. Section 4. The First Great Awakening. Shifting gears a bit now, we move from economics and politics to the highly emotional third pillar of our story, the First Great Awakening. This was a massive, sweeping religious revival that took over the mainland colonies in the early 1740s. Now, what's really interesting about this movement is how intensely different it was from the rigid, highly analytical tone of everyday colonial life up to that point. Take the Connecticut minister Jonathan Edwards, for example. He preached this incredibly demanding, highly emotional Calvinist theology. His famous 1741 sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, painted a terrifyingly vivid picture of divine wrath just dangling over people. He literally reduced entire congregations to weeping and absolute terror. It was a total disruption of the traditional, quiet, sit-in-your-pew church experience. But the awakening truly reached a continental scale, thanks to one specific guy, George Whitefield. He was an English minister with this incredible, theatrical, booming voice. And Whitefield did something revolutionary. He bypassed the established churches entirely. Instead, he went straight to ordinary people. Servants, women, the enslaved, the propertied, it didn't matter. He drew crowds of thousands in these massive outdoor meetings. His preaching tours from Georgia all the way up to New England really represented the very first mass communication event in American history that actually united ordinary people across all 13 colonies. And this wasn't just some fleeting emotional moment. It left a very real, tangible, physical legacy. In order to train a completely new breed of what they called new light ministers, basically clergy who preached from the heart rather than just dryly reading off a manuscript, these revivalist denominations went out and founded entirely new colleges. Institutions you definitely know today, like Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth, were literally born straight out of this exact religious fervor. So why does all of this matter for the revolution? Well, because the Great Awakening completely democratized spiritual authority. It essentially told ordinary colonial men and women that they were equally capable of receiving grace, and, crucially, evaluating their own spiritual leaders. Think about it. Culturally, if you were empowered to evaluate and choose your own church authority, you are so much better prepared to eventually challenge your civil authority. Interestingly, it also planted some incredibly complex, though unresolved, seeds of anti-slavery sentiment. Groups like the Quakers started arguing that spiritual equality simply must apply to enslaved people as well, even while figures like Whitefield were performing total mental gymnastics to somehow reconcile his theology with his own slaveholding. Section 5, Crucible of American Identity. All right, let's bring all three of these historical threads together as we step into 1754, right before the British Empire decided it was finally time to really assert its authority. We've got our three forces: economics through the Navigation Acts, politics through Salutary Neglect, and culture through the Great Awakening. So the crucial point is this deep historical irony. By 1754, the British imperial framework had inadvertently handed the colonists the exact weapons they would later use against the empire. The strict trade rules ended up creating independent, highly resentful economies. The political neglect created experienced legislators who just expected self-governance, and the religious revival created a shared cultural connection and a deeply ingrained habit of democratic judgment. I want to leave you with this final, genuinely provocative thought. The British Empire really only held together in 1754 because it hadn't yet tried to strictly enforce its own rules. When Parliament finally tried to make the colonies pay for imperial defense after 1763, they fully expected to find passive, obedient subjects. Instead, they found a politically experienced, culturally connected, and economically savvy people. It really begs the question, if the British Empire had strictly enforced its laws from day one, if it had never allowed that era of salutary neglect, would the United States even exist today? It's a pretty fascinating consequence of history to ponder. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the history you think you know.